think you said at the peak of your career, you did 15 deals in 12 months. How does something like that even happen?
Yeah, once you get rolling, even at the end of my time at Square, we were doing up to like a deal a month, a little bit faster than that actually. That happens because you start to build the muscle. Is it a good time to do M&A? I think that it's actually an incredible time. If you have product market fit, if you're a growth stage company, this is a really interesting time to be thinking about building a corporate development team. One of the things that can really hurt deals, and maybe the most common one, is a bad integration strategy, which
Mm.
means that integration, who reports to whom and why, how it aligns with everything that's happening around the strategy of the deal, et cetera. It's unprecedented that you have massive multi-trillion dollar incumbents who are actually the most innovative companies in our space and continue to be innovators.
Welcome to Turpentine Finance, a podcast where we talk with top founders and finance leaders about what it takes to architect success. Our guests speak candidly about big business inflections, market curveballs, and how they approach decision-making so that you have the tactics and mental models for when the pressure is on. I'm your host, Sasha Orloff, founder, CEO, and self-professed finance nerd. You ready? Let's dive in. All right. Welcome, everybody. This one is going to be fun, not just because Rishi is amazing, but it's a really fascinating topic. So I was lucky enough in my first company to be invited by Y Combinator to a dinner focused on corp dev and M&A 101 for growth stage CEOs. And it was fascinating. And so we got to hear everything from insights about how to think about M&A, the importance of M&A as a tool for scaling companies, and of course, the fun stuff, the gotchas, the pitfalls, and the misconceptions. So today, all of you guys are in for a treat because the star of that talk, Rishi, is here today. So Rishi has had an insane career, right? Global head of corp development and strategy at Twitter, little company, another little company called Square, current partner at Mayfield, which is one of Silicon Valley's oldest and most successful venture funds. He also sold a venture-backed company he co-founded called FanSnap and was part of the M&A team at MTV Networks. In a really interesting time in tech history, the dawn of social networking. So we're going to get some really great perspectives on how sometimes tech companies can create and destroy value in M&A. And so Rishi was generous enough to share some of his insights from this private dinner for all of you. All right, let's go. Rishi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sasha. It's great to be here.
All right, there's so many angles to unpack. Let's focus today on how to think about corp dev and M&A if you never have. So whether you're a founder or a finance leader at a growth stage company, this is your primer. All right, so to set the stage, we can think about these things as both seller side and buyer side. Let's start with the buyer side. How should companies and finance teams think about and care about M&A and corp dev?
Thanks, Sasha. I think sometimes this topic kind of sounds boring, like M&A, but it's actually the topic that makes our whole industry run around and go around. Like I think something like 19% of companies even touch the possibility of going public. The vast, vast majority of companies end up exiting via selling their company to some other buyer. So it really is kind of the lifeblood, one of the lifebloods of our whole industry. And so I just think it's a really fascinating topic. And the more that I've worked with both founders and with growth stage CEOs, I find them coming to the table kind of new to the topic. So I think it's really good to kind of revisit it, even though it's such a crucial part of our whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
So you asked first about buyers. There's buyers and sellers. We'll kind of cover both today. On the buyer side, like there's big companies like all the FANG companies, the Googles and Facebooks of the world that I think it's pretty well documented. They've built incredible businesses by using M&A, Google, YouTube, DoubleClick famously, Facebook with WhatsApp and Instagram, and the list goes on. Where I think it's really interesting for us and probably your audience today is talk about growth stage companies. Like you're a founder, the company's growing. At some point, you kind of start to wonder, like, should I be thinking about an M&A program? And then the next question is, well, what do you do? And what's the right time for that? And from my perspective, there's certain moments that make that question really important. Right. Let's say that you're at a certain point in your life cycle. Sorry, I think I'm off topic here a little bit.
Not at all. It's like, I think what you're getting at is like, there's a lot to unpack. So why don't we start first with like, how do you even know if you're ready to think about or consider M&A as a company?
Yeah. I think one of the first things is if you have some kind of product market fit, like you're clearly off to the races, people are pulling the products out of your hand. You've probably raised a kind of significant amount of capital, although that's not the only indication. And so you have a certain amount of momentum. in the market. And now you're probably ready to think about how you expand and capitalize on that momentum by potentially doing some M&A. The second thing is you have some organizational momentum, which means that you have enough leadership in place and enough organizational structure where the idea of running an M&A deal and adding someone to the team or adding someone to the company isn't going to slow you down too much, assuming that you can get the process working correctly. And there's another nuance to this, which I think is really important. Certain companies, and a lot of enterprise software companies, for example, once you get product market fit, you kind of have an unfair advantage in your go-to-market. I'll use the example of Square, which is one I know really well, now called Block. A couple of years into Square, it was pretty clear that they were the only company that could cost effectively acquire small businesses for the payment solution. And because we suddenly have software running on millions of small businesses' handsets, we had this incredible platform and like sort of space to start to add interesting products, features, and services into that relationship with a customer. So we had this kind of unfair distribution advantage that gave us a lot of leverage. And a lot of companies that achieve product market fit find themselves with the situation where customers really trust them. And so they can start to add more and more to the palette to kind of super serve the customer. And that's a good opportunity as well. And then the final thing I'd say is people start to come to you. A lot of times growth stage founders will find that they start having ideas about companies to acquire, or their customers are potentially interesting acquisition targets, or their partners or employees can start saying to you, hey, I think we should really think about X, Y, Z deal. And that might be a good indication that you're starting to get ready for that next stage in your growth.
So let's assume these things are starting to happen. You mentioned there's a couple different ways in which you think about M&A from a buy side. There was a bottoms up, a top down, or a way to actually kind of force defining strategy. Can you explain and talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, totally. So for buyers, for growth stage technology companies, the question becomes, what's the point of an M&A team? Like, is it to do deals or something else? And I like to define the role of the M&A team or the corporate development team as surfacing and addressing the company's most important opportunities. So the key here and the key nuance here is that M&A teams and the corporate development thing is about learning. You're not going to do every deal you want to do for whatever reason, but if you structure the process properly, you can be learning and getting better as a company all the time, thanks to your corporate development team, right? So how does that look? Well, the first role the corporate development teams have is what I call tops down. That means you get to know the company really well, all the GMs and product leadership, as well as the vision of the CEO. And you think together about what's the best way to go and accelerate accomplishing that vision in the core areas that you think are most crucial to the company. The second way is bottoms up. Bottoms up means that you're out there in the world meeting companies all the time. And a lot of times those companies map directly to those priorities we talked about in the tops down framework. But a lot of times you're meeting companies all the time that may not perfectly map to that. Or if they do map to that, they're doing something a little different from the way you guys are thinking about the world. And that's a really important way that corporate development teams, because they're out there, feet on the ground, can inform the company's strategy, inform the product strategy, and help the company see around corners in interesting ways. And that gets me to the third piece, which is once you have a team up and running and your M&A team is starting to have an influential role inside the organization, I think corporate development as a function can really influence strategy in a positive way. Because when it comes to the tops down approach, you start having to ask this question, what is the most important priority? Is the seller product more important than the consumer product? Why? How much should we pay for these things? M&A deals are wonderful moments to force a lot of attention on important strategic priorities because usually you're paying some money for something or non-linearly accelerating the business in some way. And that just makes for great moments for making the company better.
One of the things that I think is a constant challenge for founders and finance teams is you start, especially in the early days when you're first starting to hit product market fit, is you have a vision. That's what you funded. That's what you are built on. That's what you're sort of racing towards. And then you get to a stage where it's kind of getting bigger and you're having more success, like you mentioned. And so how do you help think through, or should corp dev or M&A be a tool for assessing, should M&A be an accelerant to our current roadmap, or inevitably new platforms emerge, new technologies emerge, new maybe user experiences emerge as a sort of like maybe a way to also expand? Like, should we think vertically? Should we think horizontally? Should we think like it's actually a separate product line that the customer's already buying? So that would just be like buying revenue. How should we sort of evaluate when these things make sense?
It is kind of the question of M&A. A lot of times when people think about it, they're like, hey, I'm in one business, and now there's an adjacent business that I can get into that's going to open up a whole new vista. I think the key question is going back to what the whole point of this is like, how aligned is the strategy of the company? If there's a lot of clarity strategically about what to do next, then usually what you're doing is it's a little more quote unquote vertical. You own a point of sale system that's great for coffee shops, and now want to own a point of sale system that's really great for local retailers. That could be a way to go. Versus saying, hey, we're in the payments business. I also want to get into a business that's completely off topic or completely different, because I think there's some synergies that make the overall company better. And those can work too. But most growth stage companies, if they have kind of met the first criteria I talked about, where you're kind of onto something, you are onto something, you've got an unfair advantage, you've got momentum, there's usually a lot of wood to chop just in building out and expanding the platform you have. And it can really sort of create a lot more girth and value in the market. The other thing I'll say is getting into entirely new business lines can be a great way to use M&A, provided that, again, there's a lot of clarity around it, but also that you're not betting the farm on some new move, right? So getting into some category or business line where maybe you're making a small investment and there's a lot of interest in seeing how it can work out can be a totally reasonable and rational thing to do. And obviously there's exceptions to that, but generally speaking, from what I've seen, that's how people are able to be successful at it.
So obviously complicated. That's why you built a successful career and have job security should you ever want to do that again and not be a VC. But let's go back to let's assume that some of our listeners have never done any M&A. You're starting to get excited about it. They're seeing traction. Maybe it's a vertical expansion. Maybe it's a roadmap accelerator. Maybe it's tops down. Maybe it's bottoms up. Maybe it's just something that sounds interesting and could help sort of drive this forward. How do you get started? Like, do you need to build a team? Where does M&A sit? Like, what are the first steps?
Yeah. Well, so most of the time, what I've seen is that there's some pull from the market and or pull from the CEO. What do I mean by that? The CEO's like, man, I really want to go after XYZ companies. Or a product lead comes and says, I really want to go in this new business line or acquire this company. And now you have the question of, well, who fields those kinds of ideas and questions? Usually what happens, a lot of times finance teams will put a person on it, kind of part-time, right? A lot of times, a chief of staffy kind of business person, someone who's kind of a jack of all trades, the ones I'm talking about. Sometimes they're in biz ops and they come out of consulting and now they're at the company or something similar like that. Will just be asked to start taking these pitches, pulling together what the value might be and how it looks. And I'm here to advocate that that's actually a really good place to start. Because one of the most important things about M&A and corporate development is it's entirely influential. They don't own the companies after they buy them. It's such a cross-functional thing that people in the company who already have a lot of trust in a multidisciplinary way around the company are usually great places to start. And then pretty soon after that, you start to realize you want some actual expertise on the corporate development side. And this is usually when people hire their first corporate development lead. And I like forming teams in the early days where you've got a corporate development lead and maybe that person I mentioned earlier, the person who's already at the company, and kind of together they're partnering to go and get deals done, right? And so from a team building perspective, that's how I've seen it usually works. There are categories where a founder or a CEO will say, you know what, we really need to do programmatic M&A and I want to build a muscle, and they'll hire a corporate development person up front, and that's a great way to do it too. Now, who do you hire? One of the biggest mistakes people make, I think, is they think that it's just a transactional job. And the truth is, especially for growth stage technology, corporate development, it's pretty different from a transactional job. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot about learning. It's a lot about selling. You're convincing founders to join forces with you. It's a lot about product. You've got to talk to the product guys and have them really trust you that when you push back on ideas or support ideas, that you actually have a stake in the matter and can understand what's going on. You've got to be able to speak with some facility with engineering, because a lot of times engineers and the engineering leadership will really want to know that something that you're acquiring is going to fit into the overall technology stack and that the quality of the engineering will not be dilutive to the quality of the engineering that's already established. So there's all kinds of considerations, in addition to being pretty good at legal, good at deal negotiation, good at the transactional elements of the business. So it's a really multidisciplinary role. Most growth stage technology companies, I think, that do this effectively have learned that the best way to start doing a corporate development practice is to hire someone from another corporate development team, because it does have this kind of unicorny status in this multidimensional way where you can't necessarily get there just by having a banker sort of join the team or a consultant or something like that. You want someone who's actually spent some time trying to build the corporate development muscle inside of another company. One experience I've had that's really gratifying is a bunch of people that I've been fortunate to work with have gone on to run corporate development at other companies all over the Valley. And you can see just how valuable it is for them to take that expertise and go from company to company.
So, I mean, I would love a little peek behind the scenes. You've done this so many times. How do you even start? How do you even start a conversation? Because I think what the saying is, like, companies aren't bought, they're sold, or what? Companies aren't sold, they're bought, whatever it is. It's like, are people saying, like, hey, founder, hey Rishi, I want to sell my company, like, will you buy it? Versus, like, somebody has to start that conversation. I'm guessing you've started that conversation a few times. How do you start that conversation?
If you're the buyer, you're asking, like, if you're the buyer. Yeah. So usually once you have folks kind of sitting in the role of corporate development, they're armed, even in the early days, with some concept of what the company's trying to do, what the buyer's trying to do out in the world, and what their vision is and what their mission is. And you start thinking about companies that might fit into that mission or vision. And then you just start reaching out to them. Usually you do it the same way you do any other kind of business development or external relationship. You try to get warm intros. You try to see who knows somebody. I will say that one of the most common ways that companies end up in an M&A conversation is they start out in a business development or other kind of conversation. So, for example, one thing that happened all the time with Twitter is companies would be partnering or seeking to partner with Twitter from a biz dev perspective, because they wanted to work with us from an ad tech perspective on the ad tech stack. And that led to more and more alignment and deeper relationships. And over time, we realized the companies would be better together than they would apart. So that's actually a really common way that it happens. Another common way it happens is that CEOs have small investments in different companies, different sizes, at different stages. And they'll sort of say, hey, listen, there's a company here I think is really interesting. I've developed a relationship with the CEO, or I'm a mentor, and I want to think about whether or not to be a good fit for our company. So those are all places that start to build, just sort of the typical ways that relationships get fomented in the Valley are often the way it happens. Now, there's a meme of, like, companies should be heads down building, and you don't want to talk to corp dev. Famously, Paul Graham kind of espoused this in a blog post about 10 years ago. And I think it's actually a good point for very early stage companies that are just trying to get their first product out. And the last thing you want to do is be distracted by people knocking on your door from big companies who may want to buy you when you literally have nothing. I do think that most companies are receptive to initial conversations, to buyers that are starting to look to develop relationships. And I think they should be. We can talk about that more on the seller side, but I think that's an important part of how it happens.
Hey, we'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Hey, everybody. If you're a business owner or founder like me, you'll want to know more about our sponsor, Netsuite. Netsuite provides financial software for all your businesses. Whether you're looking for an ERP tool or accounting software, Netsuite gives you the visibility and control you need to make better decisions faster. And for the first time in Netsuite's 25 years as the #1 cloud financial system, you can defer payments of a full Netsuite implementation for 6 months. That's no payment and no interest for 6 months. And you can take advantage of the special financing offered today. Netsuite is #1 because they give your business everything you need in real time, all in one place, to reduce manual processes, boost efficiency, build forecasts, and increase productivity across every department. More than 36,000 companies have already upgraded to Netsuite, gaining visibility and control over their financials, inventory, HR, e-commerce, and more. If you've been checking out Netsuite already, then you know this deal is unprecedented. No interest, no payments. So take advantage of the special financing offer with our promo code at netsuite.com/turpentine. That's netsuite.com/turpentine to get the visibility and control your business needs to weather any storm. netsuite.com/turpentine.
Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes.
Do you literally just ask, like, hey, I mean, clearly, if there's an email sent out, it's going to say like Rishi Corp Dev on the bottom. So there's already some pretense there. But are you literally like, hey, are you open to a conversation about an acquisition, or do you sort of subtly, what's the magic of Rishi here?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's a dance. Same way when you're raising capital, same way when you're doing any transaction of any kind out here. I think what you're trying to say is something to the effect of, hey, I saw what you guys are doing. I'm really interested in this great product that you have. It seems like it's super relevant for what we're doing over here at XYZ company. I'd love to sit down and see if you're open to a coffee. It's a low stakes conversation for both sides. And again, if both sides are thinking about it the right way, it should be an opportunity for shared learning. It's a chance for the potential buyer to just kind of talk a little bit about what they're doing and why, without disclosing too much. And similarly, a chance for the seller to do a little bit of that as well, and maybe also learn. But these kinds of conversations happen at a high level all the time. And it's like any other business development funnel. You might reach out to 20 companies through various means, and the ones that are super warm intros, you'll have a 100% hit rate. And the ones that are not warm intros, you have a 10% hit rate, and you end up somewhere in the middle, and that forms your pipeline.
How, and then I'm starting to sort of continue to peel the onion here, I guess. Yeah. One of the things that we've heard in the Valley is that there's some companies who use corp dev or M&A as a way to steal IP, or not steal IP, I guess, but to like learn, and for a variety of reasons, either like they're exploring the market, or maybe they decide at the end, like, hey, this is just something we can build ourselves versus sort of going to buy. How do you overcome that concern? Is that fair?
I think it's a really fair concern. There's always, in the sense that while I think it's pretty rare that the buyers out there in the Silicon Valley are just fishing for the nefarious purpose of learning more about potential competitors without ever intending to actually potentially have some kind of a more meaningful relationship, and are untransparent in doing so. I should think that kind of behavior is pretty rare. But it certainly is the case that there's not very much downside for a corporate development person to reach out to a startup and say, hey, listen, let's meet up for something and start talking about something in the hopes of learning. Because like I said, M&A is about learning. What I coach founders to do who are selling their companies, or might be on the sell side, is to be circumspect about disclosure. So if you're the seller, if you're a startup and an M&A person reaches out to you and they say you want to meet up, and it seems relevant to you, that means it's a potential partner that might be in your industry, or maybe it's someone that could be an actual biz dev partner down the road for you, and you're really curious about what they're up to. Taking the meeting has the benefit of allowing you to ask questions and learn about this other ecosystem player. And a lot of times, people will be reasonably open on the buyer side of starting to share a little bit about what they're thinking about, because they also want to learn a little bit about what you're doing. And then your job on the seller side as a startup is not to disclose too much. Give a little bit of openness about what your goals are, a little bit of openness about the breadth of your the breadth of your ambition. There's this fear that if I say anything to a buyer, they're going to steal my idea. And it's just very rarely that's the case. Most of the time, your real competitive advantage is not the idea, which are plentiful in the Valley, but your execution around it, and the speed with which you execute. Yet I think that founders miss chances to start developing long-term relationships with buyers because they fear that, and I think unnecessarily so.
Cool. We'll go into this a little bit when we transition over to the sell side. I think Chris Bakke, who has started and sold multiple companies, talks about this a lot, about thinking about M&A earlier on. Before we get there, but from the buy side still, one of the things that I thought was really fun about that talk was kicking off it with something along the lines of like the top 10 misconceptions about M&A. What are some of your favorite or some of the misconceptions that you want to share with the audience?
Okay, so one of the ones I love is you should grow all your own products. I say this because at Square, we had a very strong not invented here dynamic of the company. And understandably, we had a really beautiful product and incredible engineering. And so that was something we had to overcome. But I think the matter has been somewhat settled. If you look at the history of world-class companies, there's usually some acquisition or nonlinear kind of inorganic growth stuff happening to help that company be successful. And we've already discussed some of the examples. So I still hear that all the time. It's a hard thing to like get your head around that we're not going to just build it all ourselves, but that's an important one. There's another one that's around the valley quite a lot, actually, believe it or not, which is that M&A deals aren't usually successful. And it's funny, I still hear this all the time from different people. I hear it all the time from the rank and file at companies. It can make it hard to stand up an M&A program because some of the employees sort of feel like, why would we do this when I hear that M&A deals aren't successful? I think it's actually the case that over the last 20, 25 years in particular, like companies have gotten pretty good at doing this. And so you start to realize that if you just do it programmatically, if you put good people in the role of leading the M&A team, if you build a margin of safety into your deals, or you're not betting the farm on a transaction, but starting with tuck-ins or talent acquisitions and then moving up to larger deals as you develop the muscle, I think we've shown that M&A is actually pretty darn successful. And then the other misconception I think is really an interesting one is thinking about it as primarily finance, putting a banker in the role, thinking about it as primarily a transactional thing. I think it's so important to see this function as an extension of the product team, an extension of the CEO's strategy, as a way of using this for learning and for helping the incumbent get better and better at executing their vision.
All right. So here's a question I've been dying to ask that we did not prep for. So feel free to say no. One of the things that I think is always feels confusing outside as somebody who's never done M&A as part of the growth strategy is how to think about company valuation. So not knowing anything about it, it's easier to draw this comparison in the public markets where sometimes a company gets acquired and like the market cap goes up, that it like not only pays for the acquisition, it's like a free acquisition and revenue buy, you actually have increased enterprise value. Sometimes as a public company, they announce a big acquisition and the stock price goes down a little bit. Any comments on that? And then how should we think about that as founders and finance teams of growth stage private companies?
Yeah, really good question. So in the public markets, it's always good not to get too focused on like sort of near-term stock price changes because it takes a while for the market to digest certain acquisitions. And one thing to keep in mind is almost always public company leadership knows more than anybody else does about their prospects as a business. And so they tend to have, especially at big public companies or any public companies, acquisitions tend to have a lot of thinking behind them. And so really you can only tell in the future, in the fullness of time, how something will play out. I always point out Google was worth, I think, 17 something billion. And when they bought YouTube for 1.6 billion, which follows the 10% rule of trying to keep a little bit of a ceiling on how much you'll end up at the farm on any given acquisition. And what's YouTube worth now? 400 billion? It's hard to say, like, depending on the estimate. So it's hard to anticipate kind of the fullness of potential expansion, the fullness of time when you're sitting in any given moment. The other thing is, and why M&A I think is still so important, is that in the long run, owning a category gives you an unfair percentage of the market cap in any given space. Like Google search business is worth way more than Yahoo search business, than if you just compared them by their ratable market shares. So when you're the winner, you really win when it comes to value. And that's a big part of the reason that companies pursue M&A so aggressively is because they're trying to occupy that girth in a market. When it comes to growth stage companies starting to do M&A, it sort of depends how much you pay for a company. It depends on a few different things. It depends on how much you actually know about the company. So if you're just doing a talent acquisition, you sort of figure out based upon the comparables of like how much it would cost to buy those people in the market or how they could accelerate any given initiative that you have at the company. And you try to put a price on it, and it's squishy to some degree. And the more that you do, the more you have some reference deals to kind of go off of, and you kind of go from there. If you're buying a company that has 100 million in revenue and 35 million in EBITDA, you're much more likely to use public market metrics to sort of analyze the business and to come up with a value for it, right? And so there's a lot more meat on the bone around that. In the end, it's always a judgment call. It's a call about why we think the business can help make our business more successful. It's making some assumptions about how that expanded presence will enhance the overall value of the company. And then finding a way to, again, create a margin of safety. In a lot of ways, this process can be a little bit like venture capital, where you're going to put a certain amount of investment, which is the acquisition price, into a company, and then some subsequent investment as well. And what you're hoping is for asymmetric upside, right? And a lot of the best deals in M&A history sort of look like that, even very, very small deals. I love the example of Google Applied Semantic, which formed the basis for AdWords. And we all know how that turned out. That was like a $100 million, $200 million deal, right? So some of these very, very small acquisitions that have that upside potential can be really game-changing for a buyer.
All right. One other potential secret question, feel free to say no. Is there like a playbook, an unspoken playbook about how much you pay for talent acquisition along the way?
Oh, totally. There used to be, in kind of the heyday of the consumer explosion that happened after the launch of the App Store. So like after 2008, 2009, for the next kind of 6-7 years, talent acquisitions had this really common parlance. A bunch of small companies are getting started, they sell. Okay. And people had different ideas. Was it $1 million per engineer or whatever? And roughly it kind of mapped ultimately more or less to what a similar kind of person or team would get if they walked in off the street. And then you give them some premium because they're a group, or you give them some premium because they have expertise, because they can work together well. This is what we did at Square. At Square, we would acquire or acquire teams and then set them whole cloth at a problem. And we would leverage the fact that they'd already worked together and had some experience getting product out the door to accelerate those initiatives. And that actually worked pretty darn well. It built a bunch of the business units and business lines that Square ended up capitalizing on. So is there like a rule of thumb? I would say like look to what a similarly situated kind of individual or set of individuals would cost if they walked in off the street, and then usually add like a 25 to 50% premium. That's kind of where things work out. I'll tell you what, they're not as common as they used to be. People do talent acquisitions, but not the way that they used to. Nowadays, we have versions of them with what's happening in AI and engineering teams and kind of what happened with inflection and stuff like that. But it's relatively speaking, I think, compared to 5-7 years ago, more rare to hear this kind of thing.
I think that brings up a good point. There was like a heyday in the valley of M&A during like a period of time. Why do you think that isn't the same now? And do you think now is a good time to do M&A?
I think now is a very interesting time to do M&A. But let me answer your first question first, because I think that's an interesting one. Why do we see less M&A? It's been talked about a bunch. It doesn't feel like there's a deal a day happening. If you look at the late 90s as another example of like kind of the end of a tech boom, there was a ton of acquisitions happening then. There's also a ton of IPOs, but there's just a lot of activity. And I think there's a few things at play. One is that definitely there's a regulatory component. So there's more antitrust scrutiny. That doesn't usually apply to the smaller deals, but it does mean that some of the bigger buyers are a little bit less active and maybe a little bit more careful than they used to be. But there's some other things happening too over the last few years. I mean, obviously we had this like crazy run up over COVID, where if you were a startup, you could get capital. And if you can raise more capital, you're probably not going to sell your company. So I think that really depressed M&A for a while. And everyone for a while thought they were going to make it all the way to the promised land. And, and then it did happen. I think another thing that happens is like, it's really hard when you're having layoffs to justify internally buying a bunch of companies, doing talent acquisitions or paying premiums. So that's put a damper on things. I think the other thing that is really important is the big tech companies, a lot of the buyers are just really good at internal development. I mean, it's unprecedented that you have massive multi-trillion-dollar incumbents who are actually the most innovative companies in our space and continue to be innovative. That's just we haven't seen that all the time. We tend to think of like the IBMs of the world as being sort of plodding and not able to keep up. But that's not been the case with the big tech incumbents today. They're the ones leading the charge. So that's another really big factor. And there's another thing too that I think is close to what's happening in venture, which is when you have the big technology disruption of the moment is AI, right? By disruption, I mean it's a new important factor that is in the water, affecting every single company out there and every single strategy. But it's also changing really fast. AI is getting more and more powerful, more and more quickly. It's a little bit unpredictable. You don't actually know if you're a company, how AI is going to affect you in 2 years, because you don't know how quickly things are going to happen and what's going to change. And so there's sort of this obsolescence risk that comes about. And it's affecting how venture investors think about investing in companies. It's affecting how M&A deals get done as well. So all those things are coming together to make M&A sort of the way that we've thought about it, which is like, again, the way that most founders exit their companies, a little bit more depressed than it's been. Now, is it a good time to do M&A? I think that it's actually an incredible time. If you have product market fit, if you're a growth stage company, this is a really interesting time to be thinking about building a corporate development team. Why do I think that? Because you're in a moment right now where there's not a ton of venture dollars sloshing around in all these different categories. It is kind of following certain elements of AI and infrastructure, certain kinds of SaaS. So there's a lot of companies that aren't going to raise money. And if you are one of these companies that's already gotten to the other side of product market fit and can raise capital and has a customer base and all those things we talked about, I mean, you have all the power. So your ability right now to look at the landscape of startups and say, which ones will accelerate my business? How do I make a series of consistent bets to enhance the girth and the standing of my company? I can have my pick. I can probably get favorable terms to some degree in certain categories, not in all, but in some. And there's probably a lot of interest on the part of the sellers to find a home and return capital to investors. So I think it's just a really special time. In the consumer market, in certain areas of bottoms of SaaS, consumer, some of these areas that are kind of, I call them categories that don't have gatekeepers, where it's just the product-led growth is the main thing that's going to make the business. It's really hard right now. There's not a lot of new channels to exploit.
Yeah.
Where you can go and grow your business. And so if you are a company, even a really long-standing incumbent, you should be able right now to find amazing opportunities to expand your business.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Also, go-to-market and distribution is probably harder now than it's been in a long time with the fractionalization of distribution channels. There used to just be, when I started my first company, it was like, all right, your choices are radio, TV, Google, and that's kind of it. And then there's like Facebook and Twitter and Snap and Reddit and TikTok and social and LinkedIn and billboards and advertising and TV and then streaming and YouTube. And it's harder. And if you have a great product, it's harder to both support and the growth and distribution and being able to, I see it as a really attractive moment in time where these incumbents, for better or for worse, have massive distribution and can just layer on your product and get it into the hands of a lot of people pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. And by the way, those channels are already pretty mature. All those companies you just mentioned, with the exception of TikTok to some degree, have been around for a long time. Which is to say you can't build a company and grow, right? But it's not like it's not 2005 where people are just figuring out SEM. And if you're an emerging travel company like a Kayak, you can expand and create a huge business really efficiently on this new platform because people are adopting the platform kind of for the first time.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, this is a great time, I think, for consolidation, if you will, on both sides. And I actually think if people were a little bit better, if more growth stage companies were building out M&A teams, and we're thinking ahead to doing this and doing so programmatically, and more founders are thinking proactively about this, I think you'd actually see more M&A deals.
Hey, we'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
The Brave Search API brings affordable developer access to the Brave Search Index, an independent index of the web with over 20 billion web pages. So what makes the Brave Search Index stand out? 1, it's entirely independent and built from scratch. That means no big tech biases or extortionate prices. 2, it's built on real page visits from actual humans, collected anonymously, of course, which filters out tons of junk data. And 3, the index is refreshed with tens of millions of pages daily, so it always has accurate, up-to-date information. The Brave Search API can be used to assemble a data set to train your AI models and help with retrieval augmentation at the time of inference, all while remaining affordable with developer-first pricing. Integrating the Brave Search API into your workflow translates to more ethical data sourcing and more human representative data sets. Try the Brave Search API for free for up to 2,000 queries per month at brave.com/API. Omneky uses generative AI to enable you to launch hundreds of thousands of ad iterations that actually work. customized across all platforms with a click of a button. I believe in Omneky so much that I invested in it, and I recommend you use it too. Use CogRev to get a 10% discount.
Well, talk about volume of deals. I think you said at the peak of your career, you did 15 deals in 12 months. How does something like that even happen?
Yeah, a deal a month, once you get rolling, even at the end of my time at Square, we were doing up to like a deal a month, a little bit faster than that actually. That happens because you start to build the muscle. You know what I mean? At that point, when I came into Twitter had already had a great M&A team. They'd done a bunch of stuff. They had a lot of credibility internally. So I was lucky to be a part of that and help grow it. There's a lot of buy-in from the CEO and CFO. There's respect for the process, although we had to improve the process. You're always trying to make the process better, improve integration, et cetera. But there's also a long-standing set of relationships. So we had a lot of relationships with external companies. We had a lot of relationships internally with our BD teams, where when something was interesting, we could move pretty quickly and try to get a deal done. I always tell the story that like 14 of the 15 deals I did at Twitter in that period of time, that kind of high intensity 12-month period, were relationships that I'd had or that the company had had for at least a year or more.
Yeah.
And I think 3 of the deals were people I went to college with, which was not on purpose. It was by chance. But I think it just underscores that in some ways the value is small and relationships matter. And it's maybe the thing that both sides don't remember as much as they should when it comes to thinking about M&A on the buyer. The seller side is that in the end, it's all about people and relationships and leadership and whether or not you fit into a culture and an organization where you can make an impact.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have it's strategically important for the company. You have CEO and CFO buy-in. I'm guessing if it's deemed as important, there's respect for the process that it can go well and it might not go well. You have obviously a killer team. You have the top of the market, and then you're sort of building on these long-term relationships to evaluate. Is there any times or when does it not work out?
It doesn't work out all the time. And so the other side of the equation is, first of all, I think it's good to remember deals are sometimes not going to work out. And that's okay. It's part of the process. That's why you have a portfolio. That's why you don't bet the farm. There is a kind of a trope similar to companies are bought, not sold, which is that if you're not doing some deals that don't work, you're not taking enough risk. And I think that is to some degree true, just by dint of the fact that if your M&A sort of team and situation is working and you're up to doing several deals a year, occasionally some of those will not pan out the way you want to, especially if you're hoping for asymmetric upside and if you're taking some risk. But when they don't work, why do they not work? Well, there's a few key things. One of the things that can really hurt deals, and maybe the most common one, is a bad integration strategy, which means that integration, who reports to whom and why, how it aligns with everything that's happening around the strategy of the deal, et cetera, has just not been carefully enough thought through, so that after the transaction's over, which is the sexy part of the whole thing, the hard work begins of actually doing the slog of making the thing work, of contributing value to the enterprise. And if those considerations aren't thought through carefully, then you have attrition and a lack of employee retention, and that can kill any M&A deal. Because again, in the end, our whole industry is basically people and computers and the stuff that's on the computers. That's technology. And if the people walk out the door, then it's pretty unlikely you're going to create a lot of value long term from an M&A deal. So what can make, just to kind of back up, what can make integration a problem and where that all starts is actually just the strategic alignment of the deal. Is there a really good reason the company's being bought on the buyer side? Do they get it? Does everyone kind of get it? And does the seller believe in that strategic alignment? And everyone's on the same page. And if that's the case, you have a much higher probability of just the thing working because it makes more sense. And what happens a lot of times is and I've seen this both on teams that I've run, but in other deals at other companies as well, you'll have pretty good strategic alignment, but there's a couple of key things you don't really know. Sometimes it's okay and you go forward anyway. Other times people get excited about the deal and they kind of gloss over some of those points and hope that it'll work out. And then it doesn't. And that happens. There's definitely CEO specials. That happens all the time too, where a founder and a CEO really believe in an idea, really believe in a founder they want to bring into the fold. And you got to do those deals sometimes. And you got to trust those instincts. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. So that can all come together. There's another really important factor that I actually think plays a huge role in whether or not deals work. And it's not one that sellers can really control, but it's actually management turnover. So every deal at a company, at a buyer, has a sponsor. Usually the sponsor is a product leader, general manager, sometimes the CEO themselves. It's not someone in corp dev. It's the person who owns an area, believes that the deal should be done, and ultimately becomes responsible for whether or not the deal is successful. And so a lot of what you're betting on as a seller is your relationship with the CEO and that stability, but really on a day-to-day basis on your relationship with that sponsor, because that person is probably going to be who you report to or a big part of your team reports to. And in the end, a year from now, when they analyze the deal successful, that's going to be the person that gets called to account. If that person turns over or their job changes or whatever it is, or they get promoted sometimes companies get orphaned. And all that strategic alignment, if it's not as strong as it should be, or if the deal is largely based on one person's sort of power in the company, starts to go out the window, and then it can make it really hard to continue to create value.
All right. So we talked a little bit about, from the buyer side, what are some of the things that can happen that goes wrong? If somebody is new to this, now that you're a venture capitalist, I'm trying to see, is there a parallel here where, similar as a VC, it's kind of like a high risk, high reward bet, where if you're doing a lot of M&A or you're doing a lot of investing, the ones that pay off, like, cover all of the potential ones that don't work out. Is there a similar way that people should think about this from like a buy side M&A perspective? Does it all go into one big deal and everything has to make that work? Or should there be a portfolio approach?
I would say it's as extreme as what you just said. It's kind of starting with a portfolio approach, doing this programmatically. That means deciding you're going to have someone running the team and consistently outreaching to companies and consistently running a corporate development process. Once you decide to do this for real and like with your full body weight, you end up getting better and better at it. You just do. And so you shouldn't have a huge amount of losses the same way you might in a venture portfolio where one single deal pays for everything. You should generally have a higher percentage of wins and successful deals measured by customer retention, strategic impact of the company, revenue, whatever it may be. And I'd say that's been borne out in most corporate development teams that I know. Most of them have reasonably high success rates, and it gets better over time as you get better at it, right? But I will also say that this comes down to sort of what your M&A philosophy is. Mine generally tends to be, and I think this really applies to this moment in time as we just talked about, you don't need on any given deal to necessarily spend a ton of money. If you, relative to your own market cap and relative to any other deal, if you have really good clarity on what you want to achieve strategically. Yeah. If you're the second in a market that you really care about and the first player in the market's not going to work, well, if it's a market that really matters, there's the second and third and fourth player. And if you have access to the customer base or credibility or capital, whatever it is that makes you an interesting incumbent as a growth stage player, then you can take that second or third or fourth player and compete aggressively in the market. It doesn't need to cost you that much money. And so you sort of create these opportunities, again, for asymmetric value. I think that what kind of happens, and this is a little bit different from venture, is you have a lot of doubles. You have a lot of singles and doubles. Maybe not many home runs. Those are pretty unusual, and we've talked about a few of them. But you end up with like kind of a pretty high batting average of success because you're getting better and better all the time. You're hoping that some of these turn into something really enormous in terms of their impact, but not every deal is going to do that. But when it does, you're really great. Let me say one other thing. A big part of the reason to develop this as a muscle is because there are these moments where a big deal comes along. That is 10% of your market cap or more, 20% of your market cap, whatever it may be. Sometimes even something as big as you are. Who knows? And ideally, that's not the first time that you've touched the M&A process. When you get to doing that kind of thing, you're running already. You've done a bunch of acquisitions. You know there's complexity. You know where your organization sort of gets screwed up or wrapped around the axle. You have a process in place. You know who the decision makers are. A lot of deals get killed in the early days because you start to figure out, who do I actually need to go check in with about that thing? And you sort of iron that stuff out. So you don't have these 11th hour executives kind of popping up and saying they need to be a decision maker on a deal when you're trying to get a deal done. And so you kind of iron that stuff out. And as you do that, when the big swing comes along, the fat pitch, you're able to pounce on it and execute on it effectively because you got some muscle tone already.
I mean, if there isn't a better reason to make sure that every ambitious, high successful company has Rishi on their cap table, that is a good one along the way. Before we transition over a little bit to your transition to investing, we talked a little bit about lessons learned, and you had a really kind of catchy sort of sentence. Sins of omission have been way worse for me than sins of commission. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by that is like for me, when I think about my regrets as a deal doer in all these different ways, I have come to mainly regret the deals I didn't do a couple of times. Now, a little bit of a caveat to that too is a big part of the success of the job of a head of corporate development is keeping your company from doing bad big deals, which is also something I'm happy about, but that's kind of not something you really talk about very much. When you ask about like, what's a sin of omission? There's a couple of moments in my career where we almost got there on a really interesting, important deal, and we didn't quite get it done because we weren't really ready for it. And I look back and go, oh, that would have been awesome. I'll give you one example that is deep within the annals of history, but there's a time when Square was considering buying Adyen. And Adyen obviously turned out to be a massively successful company and enormously incredible founders built that business. But there's a time when we were considering partnering with Square for that company, and that would have been a really interesting acquisition. Braintree is one that I think was actually well documented out in the market. That was something that Square almost did. That I think would have been a really good one. We had a couple of those at Twitter as well. And when you think about like our Google YouTube example, the amplification of technology, the amplification of really substantive depth in a category, even though it feels like a big thing to swallow, as long as you're not completely betting the farm, and we weren't in those cases, you have a chance to build something really big. And who knows if we had made this deal successful or not, but I look back on those and it reminds me that as long as you have that margin of safety, sometimes the biggest things that you wish you'd done are the ones you regret the most. And it's a good reminder to me, it's you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. You know what I mean? And it definitely applies to venture, and I think it applies to this as well.
All right. Now let's transition over to the other side of the table. So you've been now at Mayfield for several years. How has your time at VC make you think about M&A? Has anything changed?
There's one important thing that I think has been influential for me, which is as a founder, you're kind of aware of how you want to serve your investors and create a great return for them. You want to build a great company, and you're always thinking about the alignment between yourself and your investor. And you want to maintain that alignment. And I think I've become a lot more sensitive to the fact that there are these moments where what's the right thing to do for me as an investor, which is to encourage a founder to go long, are not necessarily the right way for a founder to think about how to maximize their chances for a business. Because keep in mind, VCs have a portfolio. So naturally, our incentive is for any given company to maximize the outcome for that company by building the biggest company possible. But founders have all their chips on one square. And so it's totally natural for them, I think, to want to consider multiple options. And so I've become a lot more aligned with the idea of liquidity throughout the process of company building, because it helps founders go long to feel a little bit less of that economic pressure as they've built value, which gives them an incentive to align better with their investors in the fullness of time and hopefully in the long term create much bigger companies. So that's been one important way that it's changed. The other thing is I've learned that as an investor, your founders want to share a lot of what they're doing with you, but they're also looking to you for support. They want you to be the cheerleader. A lot of times founders don't want to bring every single thing they're thinking about or wondering about or considering in terms of an area of focus to you as an investor. And that's totally normal and reasonable because you want to maintain kind of everyone around your board and your team kind of singing in the same songbook. But I've also learned that when it comes to M&A, a lot of times founders have more on their minds maybe than the one direction that they're considering and talking to their investor about. And I've tried to increase my sensitivity to that reality and recognize that founders are likely to have multiple perspectives on how they create value, and also be really sympathetic to the fact that a founder may have some really good reasons for selling early if they believe that the market sort of doesn't really reward the risk reward of raising more capital and going at it for longer.
Is there a threshold in which now, as somebody who used to buy a lot of companies and now somebody that invests in a lot of companies, is there a threshold in which the conversations start changing meaningfully? Like paying back capital without any return probably has a slightly different thing than, say, maybe a 2 or 3x, which isn't something that pays back your fund. It's not a fund returning investment, but can like actually be pretty meaningful for founders and some of their early hires along the way. I'm assuming at some point, say 5 or 10x above, it becomes a much more easier decision. What should be the breakpoints, and how do you think about those now?
I don't think there's any one breakpoint. For most venture capitalists, and I think this applies to the firms that we've discussed, it applies to really most firms that I've been a part of or had the pleasure of working with, you're kind of in it for this asymmetric upside thing. You know what I mean? You're in it to create category defining public companies. You hear that all the time from the Sequoias on down. The firms I've been a part of are no different. And the functional difference for the investor between a 1x and a 3x, if you're an early stage investor, is not that huge. I would say they're the same. Everyone wants to have at least a 3x return. But like you said, it's not going to return the fund, right? If you think about the cap table of the founder, the difference between a 1x and a 3x for the common is actually enormous. There's enormously more value for the founder relative to their interests. And so, not just the founder, but the entire like sort of common cap table. So again, the ideal situation is that your investors, your CEO and your founders, your board together can have a clear-eyed perspective on what the opportunities out there in the market, and hopefully come to a shared perspective. Like, hey, yeah, we're after a multi-billion-dollar public company opportunity. That's still what we believe. Here's how we get there. We're going to take the next step and go for it. And if we need some liquidity on the way, that's great. Or, hey guys, the way this market's evolving, maybe we missed our chance. Maybe it's going to cost a lot more money than we thought before we raise another round. Maybe we should get ahead of thinking about M&A. And I'll tell you the one thing I talk to seed stage founders all the time about is, and increasingly lately, is you may or may not have your board as your partner. You may not even have a board in thinking about these potential outcomes. And they're not going to kind of do it for you, because investors' jobs are to build these category defining public companies that can return the whole fund. So you're probably going to have to take the reins and kind of take a step back and say, hey, I'm going to build as much value as I can. Maybe I've got a year runway, 2 years runway, whatever, but how do I systematically kind of set myself up to, if I need or I want to sell my company, I've got the relationships in place. I'm not just trying to sell it all of a sudden. I can position myself to be bought, not sold, because the strategic alignment's already there with a potential acquirer. And I just think that's a great way for founders to be paid back for all the incredible amount of work that they're putting in to get a win. And if that's the right thing, go on and build the next company.
All right, last question. Probably not, but last question I'll ask before we go into this.
Yeah.
So is there if you're giving advice to founders out there now about an M&A that they think they want to entertain, what would be a right way to bring this up to their investors? What would be a definitive wrong way to bring this up to their investors? Or what would be a way to start facilitating I don't know, but I want to at least talk it out?
Yeah. Well, I think you said it great at the end. Like, honesty, transparency is always the best way to do it, in my opinion. And hopefully you're prompting a conversation that is informed by your views on the market. So I think just what happens a lot of times, I think, is maybe a buyer will come and say hello. And this happens all the time in companies I've been involved with, is that a buyer will say, hey, listen, let's get together and meet and talk about what you're doing. They'll say, hey, should I go meet with this potential buyer XYZ, the corp dev team? And I'll kind of give them the same advice I tend to give founders and I've given a little bit on this podcast, which is like, here's how you do it. Don't spend too much time, but see if there's a there and kind of go from there and start the relationship development process. I think it's better to be proactive, as I've said, but this happens all the time. If there's something that's actually on the table, then obviously that's something that you want to tell the board about as soon as possible. And if it's a question where it's like, should we sell or not right now? Obviously it's very dependent on things like price and all this other stuff. But hopefully when you start into that conversation, you and the board are thinking again together from the same place. What are the best prospects for the company, right? How do we think about all these important factors that determine our risk reward in moving forward? And ideally, your board is really a partner with you that brings experience to the table. They've had some reps at this, where as a lot of times the founders having their first or second rep at this, and together you guys can make a great decision on what the right course of action is. No, I'll say one thing. I don't think any board. I have a couple of exceptions in my mind of a certain investor who has told his founders, too bad, keep going. But the vast majority of investors will not say that to their founders. The vast majority of investors, if a founder's like, look, I really want to sell the company, they'll usually be supportive of the founder, because what holds the company together? It's the will of the founder.
Yeah.
It's the will of the CEO. I mean, and there's not really anything else that the entire thing revolves around. Would you agree with that from your time as a founder and a CEO?
Yeah, I think
that's what makes the job so hard.
Yeah, it makes it job. I think, there a lot depends on the will and the energy and the drive of a founder, and so discouraging that, I think, is not in most people's best interest. And back to one of your other comments, the Valley's small and it's relationship driven, and every once in a while there's like an M&A, and that's the end of the life of a founder in the founder venture world, but not usually the case. People go on to found other companies, or they go into leadership roles where they might be acquiring other companies. It's a small world, and it feels like it gets smaller the longer we go on.
I think it's totally true. But can I comment on that real quick?
Yeah.
This is an interesting one. I've often said, and this is like empirically true, if you look at the NASDAQ, just the entire market cap of the NASDAQ, I think at least 80%, probably more, are companies that were started by first-time entrepreneurs in their teens or 20s. Apple, Facebook, Google, you've got to go. Even NVIDIA, I think Jensen was 29. It's first-time entrepreneurs in their 20s. The second biggest area are second-time entrepreneurs who had a okay exit the first time, or a pretty good exit, and then kept on becoming entrepreneurs. Repeat founders is what we call them in the venture business. There's tons of them in enterprise software. But a lot of the CEOs of companies that turn out to be really big companies, from Elon to Travis at Uber to Reed Hastings, their second, they had a pretty good start, had a pretty good exit on round one, and it wasn't necessarily the $50 billion public company. But they learned so much and went for round two and built something that was truly a juggernaut. And there's a lot of examples of that. And so again, a good investor, if a founder, again, with a clear-eyed perspective, was looking at the market saying, it's a right time to sell. It's a good time to sell. We should sell on a risk-reward basis, should be supportive, because that experience is invaluable. I mean, Sasha, you know this from your experience too. Like, how many mistakes I'm sure you don't make now. You get to make all these new mistakes because you went through the whole experience already before.
I try not to make the same mistakes, but I definitely will make a lot more mistakes and do. You've been doing this for a while now, and I see a couple gray hairs in there, the wisdom and experience. What gets you excited now from an investing point of view? Yeah.
Oh.
And if you say AI, which you are fully allowed to, you have to talk about what part of AI gets you excited.
Generative AI. What gets me excited right now? The part about the AI thing that I think is super fascinating is you had this kind of shot of adrenaline that entered the entire technology ecosystem that everybody gets to use, and that is getting cheaper to use. It's not getting cheaper to make necessarily. You have to raise like several $100 million to build a new model. But yeah, everyone has this new tool, this new toy they can use. And I think we have some ideas of like how many things it's going to change, but I think it's going to change a lot of stuff, whether it's the applications on the healthcare side, the applications for data science, the application, data centers and technology on that front, and how it's going to change other applications too. So what am I really excited about? We're not in the middle of a platform shift. We're in the middle of a tool shift. I am really fascinated by the fact that I think there's going to be a bunch of interesting platforms in the future. And how do I define platform? A platform has two sides to it. A platform is like mobile or the browser or the PC. It's usually some hardware device or something that kind of has a hardware component to it. It's usually invented by a startup like Netscape, but it's sort of plowed into the market by an incumbent like Microsoft or Apple. And on one hand, it has consumers looking to use this new thing. And on the other hand, it has suppliers of stuff for those consumers, whether it's commerce or content or services, whatever it is. And that's the lifeblood of new platforms, is that you have not only new consumers consuming this new thing, but you have all these new ways to serve the consumers. And that's where you end up with the next Ubers and Microsofts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Well, that hasn't happened yet. But I think that's going to happen along multiple dimensions because of all the technology disruption that's occurring right now. Like, a lot has been made of the future of AR because of the Vision Pro and how far we have to go to get to a place where we really are in an AR world. But an AR world is like a few years away. And it's a little bit unpredictable because the acceleration of technology is really unprecedented right now. So what I'm excited about is all the different ways that new platforms could emerge that isn't just one kind of platform, but could exist in multiple dimensions. To me, that's really exciting. I also think it's really interesting that you can build interesting companies right now with much fewer people. I think we need that. I think you're going to have to find more and more new ways of entrepreneurship to take root. I think that's happening more and more. So like a lot of my work across Twitter and Square and elsewhere is about putting people in business. I love businesses that put people in business.
Yeah.
You know? And I think there's going to be a lot more ways to be in business now going forward. We're having a little bits of blips with the D2C brands world and commerce platforms and this and that, but we have so many ways now to make money and to create livelihoods. And increasingly that's going to be cross-national, cross-platform. That to me is just really exciting.
What a fascinating answer. If somebody is building in this space, Align, how should they get a hold of you?
And you can reach me on Twitter at Rishi Garg.
Sounds easy enough. This was great. And we didn't even get a chance to go into any of the seller stuff. Maybe I can entice you to come back for a part 2 on the seller side perspective. Thank you so much for sharing so transparently and honestly about your experience. It was amazing. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Sasha. A lot of fun.
Cool. All right.